I found the pawn shop receipt tucked inside the silk lining of my mother's vintage jewelry box, dated 3 days after my father's funeral. My sister, Sloane, had wept the loudest at the graveside, clutching a damp handkerchief and leaning heavily on my shoulder, but the receipt showed she had been busy valuing our mother's heirloom emeralds, while the soil over Dad's casket was still loose. I sat on the edge of the vanity stool, the air in the bedroom smelling of stale lavender and the cedar chest my father had built by hand. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing against your eardrums. I am Nicolette, the daughter who stayed. For 6 years, I managed the appointments, the dialysis runs, and the late-night scares while Sloane sent, thinking of you texts from a high-rise 300 miles away. Now that the house was finally still, the masks were slipping. I walked into the kitchen where the afternoon sun hit the linoleum in sharp, unforgiving squares. Sloane was there, her back to me, rinsing a single teacup. She moved with a practiced grace, her hair perfectly coiffed even in mourning. "I was thinking we should start boxing up the silver tomorrow, Nick," she said, not turning around. "There's no sense in letting it sit here and tarnish. I have a contact at an estate gallery who can give us a fair appraisal." I looked at her narrow shoulders, the expensive knit of her sweater. "The emeralds aren't in the box, Sloane." The sound of the running water stopped. It didn't stop abruptly. She dialed the handle down slowly, methodically. She turned, wiping her hands on a dish towel that had been our mother's. Her expression was a masterpiece of concerned confusion. "What do you mean? I saw them there last week." "I found the slip from Miller's Fine Metals," I said, my voice sounding detached, even to my own ears. I didn't yell. I didn't have the energy for it. "You took them before the wake. While I was at the funeral home picking out the lining for the casket, you were haggling over the price of Mom's history." Sloane didn't flinch. She just leaned against the counter, the shadow of the window frame cutting across her face. "Dad left a lot of debt, Nicolette. I was trying to protect you from the mess." "Dad didn't have debt," I whispered. "He had a pension and a life insurance policy that you've already asked the lawyer about twice." The air between us curdled. For the first time, I saw the flicker of something sharp in her eyes, a calculated coldness that had been hidden behind years of polished sisterly affection. She stepped closer, the smell of her expensive perfume clashing with the scent of the dish soap. "You've lived in this house for free for years," she said softly. "Don't act like you're the only one who sacrificed." She walked past me, her shoulder brushing mine, leaving me standing in the kitchen with the receipt crumpled in my hand and the realization that the morning was over. The war had started. The next morning, the house felt different, smaller, as if the walls were leaning in to eavesdrop. Sloane didn't leave. Instead, she moved her luggage from the local inn into our parents' guest room, the one with the floral wallpaper and the view of the dying hydrangea bushes. She claimed her car was having transmission issues, but I knew the truth. She wasn't leaving until she'd audited every square inch of the life I'd built with Dad. I spent the morning in the basement, sorting through old tax returns and utility bills. I needed a paper trail. If Sloane was going to claim I lived here for free, I needed to prove that my meager salary from the library had been the only thing keeping the lights on while Dad's medical bills ate his savings alive. The basement was damp, smelling of wet concrete and old cardboard. I found a shoebox tucked behind a stack of rusted paint cans. Inside wasn't money or jewelry, but a stack of letters, handwritten notes from Dad to a man named Vance. I recognized the name. He was a cousin of ours who had disappeared from family gatherings a decade ago after a falling out over the family farm. As I read, the chill of the basement seeped into my bones. The letters weren't about the farm. They were about Sloane. "She asked again for the deed, Vance," one letter read, dated 2 years ago. "I told her Nicolette is the one who cleans the gutters and holds the basin when I'm sick. Sloane says she needs the equity to save her firm, but I can't leave Nick with nothing. She thinks I don't know about the accounts she opened in my name. I'm scared, truly." My hands shook, the yellowed paper rattling in the silence. My father, a man of few words and immense pride, had been terrified of his own daughter. He hadn't told me. He had protected me from the truth. even as he sat in his armchair watching the evening news, letting me believe we were just a tired, grieving family. A floorboard creaked directly above my head. I froze, shoving the letters back into the box and sliding it behind the paint cans just as the basement door opened. Sloane stood at the top of the stairs, silhouetted by the kitchen light. She looked like a shadow. "Nick, what are you doing down there in the dark?" Her voice drifted down, sweet and sharp as a razor. "I'm making a shopping list. I noticed the pantry is practically empty. How did you and Dad even eat?" "We managed," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wiped my dusty hands on my jeans and started up the stairs. As I reached the top, she didn't move back to let me through. She stayed in the frame, forcing me to stand on the penultimate step, looking up at her. She reached out and plucked a stray cobweb from my hair with a lingering, mock-maternal touch. "You look exhausted, honey," she whispered. "Maybe you should go stay with a friend for a few days. Let me handle the heavy lifting here. You've done enough." I looked into her eyes and saw the hunger there. She wasn't just looking for jewelry anymore. She was looking for the deed Dad had refused to give her. "I'm not going anywhere, Sloane," I said, stepping firmly past her. "This is my home." "Is it?" she asked, her voice trailing after me into the hallway. "We'll see what the will says on Friday, won't we?" Wednesday dinner was a performance of normalcy that made my skin crawl. Sloane had gone out and bought organic greens, a rotisserie chicken, and a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. She set the table using the good linen napkins, the ones Mom only pulled out for Christmas. "I saw Kellen at the market today," Sloane said, swirling her wine. Kellen was our childhood neighbor, now a real estate attorney. She took a dainty bite of chicken. "He mentioned that the zoning for this street changed last year. This lot is worth double what it was in 2020. I kept my eyes on my plate, the peas rolling around in the gravy. "It doesn't matter what it's worth. We aren't selling." "Don't be sentimental, Nicolette. It's a liability," she sighed, the sound of a patient parent explaining math to a toddler. "The roof needs $40,000 in repairs. The plumbing is a ticking time bomb. You're working part-time at a library. How were you planning on paying the property taxes next month?" I looked up, the weight of the letters I'd found in the basement burning in my mind. "I'll figure it out. I always have." "By draining Dad's remaining accounts?" she asked. Her tone was light, almost conversational, but the accusation landed like a physical blow. "I had a look at the bank statements on the bureau today. There were several large cash withdrawals over the last 6 months. Dad was bedridden. You were the only one with the debit card." The air left the room. Those withdrawals were for the specialized home care nurse we hired so I could keep my shifts at the library, and for the oxygen tanks the insurance stopped covering. Dad had insisted on paying for them himself. "Those were for his care, Sloane. I have the receipts from the medical supply company in the file cabinet." "The file cabinet in the den?" she asked, tilting her head. "The one that's currently locked. I tried to look for the life insurance policy earlier, but I couldn't find the key." She was fishing. She had tried to break into the files while I was in the shower. I felt a cold, hard knot of resolve tighten in my chest. She didn't know about the shoebox in the basement yet, and she didn't know I had moved the key to the cabinet into the pocket of my cardigan. "I'll get you the policy information when the lawyer arrives on Friday," I said, my voice steady. "Until then, stay out of the files." Sloane set her fork down with a sharp clack against the china. The mask didn't just slip, it vanished. Her face hardened, the lines around her mouth deepening with a decade of resentment. "You think you're the martyr because you stayed," she hissed. "But you stayed because you had nowhere else to go. You used him as a safety net because you were too afraid to build a life of your own. And now you're squatting in a house that is half mine, acting like I'm a guest." She stood up, leaning over the table, her shadow stretching long and jagged across the wall. "I'm going to bed. But Nicolette, don't bother hiding the keys. I've already called a locksmith for tomorrow morning. Since you won't cooperate, I'll just have to help myself." She swept out of the room, leaving her expensive wine unfinished. I sat in the dim light of the dining room, listening to her heels click on the floorboards above. She thought she was the only one who knew how to play this game. but she had forgotten that I was the one who had lived in this house for 30 years. I knew every creaking board, every hidden nook, and exactly where Dad kept the spare set of keys she didn't even know existed. The sun hadn't even burned the mist off the lawn when the white van pulled into the gravel driveway. The sound of the engine was a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards of the kitchen. I sat at the small breakfast nook, my fingers wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. I watched through the lace curtains as a man in a navy jumpsuit stepped out, carrying a heavy tool bag. Sloane was down the stairs in an instant, her silk robe billowing behind her like a cape. She didn't look like a grieving daughter, she looked like a general. "Morning, Nick," she said, her voice bright and brittle. "Since you were so protective of the keys last night, I thought I'd take the initiative. We really need to get those documents ready for the lawyer." I didn't move. I didn't protest. I just watched her lead him toward the den. I heard the metallic scrape of his tools against the brass lock of the mahogany filing cabinet, the one Dad had bought when he started his small contracting business 40 years ago. "Is there a problem, miss?" The locksmith's voice muffled through the walls. "This lock has been tampered with recently. Pins are jammed." I felt a small, dark spark of satisfaction. Last night, after Sloane had gone to bed, I hadn't just hidden the keys. I had taken a bit of Dad's wood glue and a broken toothpick and made sure no key, original or otherwise, would ever turn that lock again. "Just open it," Sloane snapped. Her patience was thinning, the polished veneer cracking further. The drilling started, a high-pitched, screeching whine that felt like it was carving a hole into the memory of the house. It lasted for 10 minutes. Then, the heavy thud of the drawer being forced open. I stood up and walked to the doorway of the den. Sloane was already rifling through the hanging folders, her movements frantic. She was looking for the blue folder, the one labeled Estate and Life. She pulled it out, her eyes scanning the pages, but her face went pale. "It's empty," she whispered, turning to me. "Nicolette, where is the policy? Where are the bank records?" I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "I told you to stay out of the files, Sloane. I didn't say everything was still inside them." "You have no right to move those documents. They are legal property of the estate," she screamed, her voice hitting a register I hadn't heard since we were children fighting over dolls. "I'm the executor, Sloane," I said quietly. "Dad changed it 6 months ago. He realized that while you were busy saving your firm, I was the one signing the consent forms for his surgeries. He didn't want you handling his mess anymore." The locksmith looked between us, looking deeply uncomfortable. He gathered his tools, took the check Sloane shoved at him, and practically fled the house. Sloane stood in the middle of the ruined den, surrounded by empty folders and the smell of drilled metal. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw real, unadulterated fear in her eyes. It wasn't fear of losing me, or fear of the truth. It was the fear of a woman who had bet everything on a windfall that was suddenly evaporating. "You're lying," she breathed. "He would never leave you in charge. You can barely manage a library budget." "Maybe," I said, turning to walk away. "But I managed to keep him safe from you for 2 years. I think I can handle a few more days." I headed for the basement. I needed to check on the shoebox. I needed to see if Vance had ever written back. The humidity in the basement felt like a physical weight. I knelt by the paint cans, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I pulled the shoebox out, but as my fingers brushed the cardboard, I froze. The lid wasn't sitting flush. A tiny, jagged tear in the side of the box caught the light, a mark that hadn't been there an hour ago. I opened it. The letters were there, but the order was wrong. I had meticulously placed the letter to Vance on top. Now, a yellowed electricity bill from 1998 sat at the summit. Sloane hadn't just been in the den. She'd been down here while I was in the shower. She was faster than I'd credited her for, and far more desperate. The sound of a car door slamming outside muffled the heavy silence. I shoved the box back into its hiding spot and hurried upstairs, my lungs burning from the basement's damp air. Through the kitchen window, I saw a rusted silver sedan idling in the driveway. A man climbed out, squinting at the house. He was tall, gaunt, with a weathered face that looked like a map of hard decisions. It was Vance. He looked older than the photos in the attic, his hair a shock of white against a tan forehead, but the eyes were unmistakably our father's. Sloane was already on the porch. I reached the screen door just as she blocked his path, her hand planted firmly on the railing. "We aren't taking visitors, Vance," she said, her voice dripping with a poisonous hospitality. "It's a private time for the family. I'm sure you understand." Vance didn't flinch. He adjusted a frayed baseball cap and looked past her, catching my eye through the mesh of the screen. "I got a message," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "From Nicolette. She said there were things that needed to be settled before Friday." I stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight. I hadn't sent Vance a message. I'd only just found his name in the letters. I looked at Sloane, and the smug, terrifyingly calm smile on her face told me everything. She had found the letters. She had seen Vance's name, and she had called him here to use him as a pawn or perhaps as a threat. "I didn't call you Vance," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. Vance frowned, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. "I got a telegram. Said the house was being sold and I needed to collect my share of the backacre before the lawyers got involved." The backacre. The piece of land Dad had supposedly stolen from Vance a decade ago, the source of the family rift. Sloane turned to me, her eyes gleaming with a triumph that made my blood run cold. "You see, Nick, this is what happens when you try to hide things. Old ghosts come knocking. And Vance here has a very valid claim to a significant portion of this property's value. If we don't sell the whole lot to pay him off, he'll sue the estate." She wasn't trying to protect the house anymore. She was trying to burn it down so she could sift through the ashes for gold. She had brought a man who hated our father into our home to finish the job she started. The air in the sitting room was stifling, thick with the smell of Sloane's expensive tea and the dust Vance had tracked in on his boots. Vance sat on the edge of Dad's armchair, the one Dad used to sit in for hours watching the birds. Seeing him there felt like a violation, a jagged piece of a broken past forced into a present that was already shattering. Sloane paced the rug, her heels leaving temporary divots in the wool. "It's quite simple, really," she said, gesturing toward Vance. "The backacre was never legally severed from Vance's father's original deed. Dad knew it. He just hoped no one would notice while he played gentleman farmer. If Nicolette insists on keeping the house, she's essentially keeping property that belongs to you, Vance." Vance looked at me. His eyes weren't cruel, but they were tired, the eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime feeling cheated. "I don't want the house, Nick," he said softly, "but I've got medical bills of my own now. Your dad." He promised he'd make it right before he passed. He wrote to me. "He wrote to you because he was afraid," I said, stepping into the center of the room. I looked at Sloane. "He was afraid of what you were doing to his accounts. He wasn't trying to hide a debt from Vance. He was trying to find a way to pay Vance without you finding out because he knew you claw back every cent." Sloane stopped packing. Her laugh was a short, sharp bark. "Oh, please, the martyr complex is getting exhausting. I'm the one trying to settle this fairly. Vance gets his payout, we sell this drafty mausoleum, and we both move on with our lives." "Is that what you told him in the telegrams, Sloane?" I asked, walking over to the window. "That I was the one refusing to pay him, that I was the hurdle." I turned back to Vance. "My father kept a record of every penny he sent you over the last 5 years, Vance. Small amounts through money orders. He didn't want it on the bank statements because Sloane had access to them." Vance's brow furrowed. "Money orders? I never got any money orders, Nicolette. Not a dime since the funeral for my own mother." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I looked at Sloane. She was leaning against the mantel, her fingers tracing a porcelain figurine. She didn't look surprised. She looked bored. "Well," Sloane said, her voice smooth as oil, "it seems Dad was more delusional than we thought in his final months, making up stories about secret payments. It just proves he wasn't in his right mind when he named you executor, doesn't it?" I realized then that the shoebox hadn't just been a discovery for me, it had been a roadmap for her. She hadn't just read the letters, she had intercepted the money. For years, She had been siphoning the restitution Dad was trying to make, keeping the wound between the two men open so she could use it as a crowbar when the time came. "You intercepted them," I whispered. "You lived 300 miles away, but you still had the mail forwarded to your office during his first hospital stay. You told him the addresses were wrong. You let him die thinking he was still a thief in his cousin's eyes." Sloane's face remained a mask of cool indifference, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the mantle. "Prove it," she dared me, her voice a low, dangerous hum. The "prove it" hung in the air, a jagged shard of glass between us. Vance looked from Sloane to me, his jaw working as he tried to process the accusation. He wasn't a stupid man, but he was a man who had been fed a decade of resentment, and Sloane was an expert at seasoning the dish. "I don't have to prove it to you, Sloane," I said, my voice dropping to a calm that surprised even me. "I just have to find where you hid the ledger." "There is no ledger, Nicolette. You're spiraling," she said, though she finally let go of the mantle. Her eyes darted toward the hallway, just a fraction of a second, a tell so subtle I would have missed it if I hadn't spent years watching her manipulate our parents. She wasn't looking toward the guest room. She was looking toward the coat closet under the stairs. I didn't run. I walked. I could feel her heart rate spiking from across the room. As I reached the closet door, Sloane moved, her silk robe snapping like a whip, but Vance stood up. He didn't touch her, but his sheer bulk, the solid, grounded presence of a man who worked the earth, blocked her path. "Let her look, Sloane," Vance said. His voice wasn't angry yet. It was something worse, suspicious. I opened the closet. It smelled of Dad's old raincoats and the mothballs Mom used for the winter blankets. I knelt down, pushing aside a row of muddy boots. Behind a stack of collapsed board games, there was a slim, leather-bound portfolio. It was tucked inside a plastic grocery bag, hidden with the kind of hurried carelessness that comes from overconfidence. I pulled it out and opened it on the floor. It wasn't just a ledger. It was a graveyard of Dad's intentions. Inside were carbon copies of the money orders, each one neatly filled out in Dad's shaky, elegant script. But stapled to the back of each one was a change of address confirmation and a series of deposit slips. The money hadn't gone to Vance. It had been redirected to a consultancy holding account with a name that matched the firm Sloane had been saving for the last 3 years. "You didn't even change the name," I whispered, looking up at her. "You were so sure I'd never look. You thought I was just the quiet girl who dusted the furniture." Vance walked over and took the portfolio from my hands. He flipped through the pages, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of red as he saw the dates. These weren't just business transactions. These were his lifeline, stolen while he was struggling to keep his own home. "You told me he hated me," Vance said, his voice trembling. He looked at Sloane, who was now backed against the wall, her face pale and sharp. "You told me he called me a leech on his deathbed." "I did what was necessary for the family," Sloane hissed, the mask finally shattering into 1,000 ugly pieces. "That money would have been wasted on your failing farm. I used it to keep a real business afloat. I'm the only one in this family who actually built something." "You built a cage, Sloane," I said, standing up, "and you just locked yourself inside it." Room went unnaturally still, the kind of silence that precedes a house shifting on its foundations. Sloane didn't cry. She didn't beg. Instead, she straightened her silk robe, her chin tilting upward in a final, desperate act of defiance. Even caught in the center of a decade-long lie, she attempted to occupy the moral high ground. "It's a civil matter at best," she said, her voice regaining its icy, corporate edge. "A few misdirected payments. Any lawyer will tell you Dad was confused, and I was merely consolidating assets to protect the estate from Vance's predatory claims. You think you've won something, Nicolette? All you've done is ensure this house gets tied up in probate for the next 5 years. You'll be 50 by the time you can afford to fix a single shingle." Vance didn't look at her. He was staring at a money order dated the month his wife had gone into the hospital, the one Dad had tried to send, the one that might have eased her final weeks. His large, calloused thumb traced Dad's handwriting. The rage I had expected from him didn't erupt. It simmered, turning into a cold, hard clarity. "I'm going to my car," Vance said, his voice flat. He tucked the portfolio under his arm. "Vance, wait. I said, reaching out. He stopped at the door, looking back at me. I'm not leaving, Nick. I'm calling the sheriff. This isn't about a property line anymore. This is theft. And I think there's a word for what she did to a dying man's finances while she had power of attorney. Sloane's eyes widened. Don't be absurd. You wouldn't involve the police in a family dispute. We aren't family, Vance said simply. He walked out, the screen door slamming behind him with a finality that echoed through the hall. Sloane turned on me, her fingers curling into claws. You bitch, you've destroyed everything. If he calls the authorities, the firm goes under. The partners find out, the audits start. Do you have any idea what you've done to my life? I didn't do anything, Sloane, I said, walking toward the kitchen. I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest, as if a heavy coat I'd been wearing for years had finally been lifted. I just stopped helping you hide. I started clearing the tea things from the table. My hands were steady. I could hear her packing in the hallway, the sound of her frantic breathing. She was a cornered animal now, looking for a way out, a side door, a new lie to tell. But the house was full of witnesses, the walls, the letters, and the daughter who finally knew her own worth. Friday, I said, over the clink of the porcelain. The lawyer will be here at 10. I suggest you have your bags packed by 9. You can't kick me out, she whispered, appearing in the kitchen doorway. Her hair was coming loose from its perfect pins. I have a right to be here. You have a right to an attorney, I replied, not looking up. I think you should go find one. Sloane didn't leave that night. She retreated to the guest room and locked the door, but the silence she left behind wasn't peaceful. It was vibrating with a frantic, desperate energy. I sat in the living room with only a single lamp on, watching the headlights of a patrol car sweep across the wallpaper as the sheriff spoke to Vance in the driveway. They stayed for a long time, the low murmur of men's voices and the scratching of pens on clipboards acting as a somber soundtrack to the end of our family as I knew it. Around midnight, the house began to groan. I heard the floorboards in the hallway protest under a light, hurried wait. I didn't get up. I knew the rhythm of this house too well. I heard the soft click of the back door latch. I walked to the kitchen and stood by the window. Outside, in the pale moonlight, I saw Sloane. She had changed into jeans and a dark hoodie, and she was carrying a small trowel and a flashlight. She was heading toward the old oak tree at the edge of the property, the place where we used to bury time capsules as children. I didn't follow her. I knew exactly what she was looking for. Years ago, Dad had joked about his emergency fund, a joke Sloane had always taken with deadly seriousness. She thought he'd buried gold or cash, something untraceable. I watched her silhouette drop to her knees, digging into the dirt with a feral intensity, her expensive manicure ruined as she clawed at the roots. She was looking for one last score to save herself, one last secret to steal. She dug for an hour. I watched the whole time, my forehead pressed against the cool glass. When she finally stopped, she sat back on her heels, her shoulders slumping. She hadn't found a chest of gold. All she had found was the rusted tin box we'd buried in 1995 containing a few friendship bracelets, a plastic dinosaur, and a photo of the two of us with chocolate on our faces. When she eventually came back inside, she smelled of wet earth and failure. She didn't see me standing in the shadows of the dining room. She looked small, her face streaked with dirt and tears that weren't for Dad, but for the version of herself she couldn't maintain anymore. I waited until she reached the bottom of the stairs before I spoke. He spent it, Sloane, I said quietly. She jumped, a small gasp escaping her throat. She looked at me, her eyes hollow. Spent what? The emergency fund. He spent it on your college tuition. The third time your firm almost collapsed, he sent you the last of it. He told me he didn't want you to feel the weight of the debt. She stared at me, the trowel still clutched in her hand. The irony was a physical blow. She had been siphoning his money because she thought he was holding out on her, never realizing he had already given her everything he had left. He loved you, I said, the words feeling like a heavy stone. Even when he was scared of you, he loved you. That was his only real mistake. She didn't respond. She just turned and climbed the stairs, one heavy step at a time, leaving a trail of garden dirt on the carpet I had vacuumed that morning. Friday morning arrived with a thin, pale sun that did little to warm the house. The lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Arris, arrived at 10 o'clock sharp. He carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen decades of family disputes. We sat in the dining room, the same room where we had eaten the cold chicken, the same room where the air had once been thick with Sloane's polished lies. Sloane sat across from me. She had tried to reclaim her dignity, wearing a sharp blazer and pearls, but the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands trembled as she reached for her water glass betrayed her. She looked like a ghost of the woman who had arrived a week ago. Mr. Arris cleared his throat, laying out the documents with a rhythmic, paper-dry sound. "The will is straightforward," he began, looking over his spectacles. "The property, this house, and the remaining liquid assets are to be divided equally between the two of you. However," he paused, pulling a smaller, hand-sealed envelope from his pocket. "Your father added a codicil 2 weeks before he passed. It stipulates that any proven debts or misappropriations, documented during his lifetime or through his estate records, must be deducted from the recipient's share and paid back to the estate or the aggrieved parties." He looked directly at Sloane. "I've been in contact with Vance, and I've seen the ledger Nicolette provided. The sum redirected to your firm over the years, Sloane, almost exactly equals the equity of your half of this house." The silence was absolute. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked, once, twice, 3 times. "Which means," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "the house is mine, entirely." Sloane didn't scream. She didn't even argue. She just looked at the table, her face ashen. She had played for the highest stakes and ended up with nothing but the clothes on her back and a looming investigation. "I'll need you to sign these waivers," Mr. Arris said, pushing the papers toward her. "Vance has agreed not to press criminal charges if the full amount is returned through the estate settlement. It's a generous offer, considering the circumstances." Sloane signed. The scratch of the pen was the only sound in the room. When she was finished, she stood up without a word and walked out of the house. I watched from the porch as she loaded her bags into her car. She didn't look back at the windows, and she didn't look back at me. She drove away, the gravel crunching under her tires until the sound faded into the distance. Vance came by later that afternoon. We didn't talk about the money or the law. We just sat on the porch steps, watching the sun dip below the trees. "He was a good man, Nick," Vance said, leaning back on his elbows. "Just a bit too quiet for his own good." "He was," I agreed. After Vance left, I walked through the rooms of my house. I felt the weight of the silence, but for the first time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like a clean slate. I opened the windows to let the spring air sweep out the smell of stale lavender and old secrets. I sat at the kitchen table, the sun warming my hands, and watched the steam rise from a fresh cup of tea. I was Nicolette, the daughter who stayed. And finally, the house belonged to someone who loved it.